in the audience for your kind attention.
Thank you.
Sibilance. Can you hear me now? Good? In the back? Hi? Okay, good.
If anybody asks a question in the panel, please repeat it so that we can catch it on the screen and on the recording.
Yes, absolutely. I'm Josh Broder. I'm from Tilson. I'll tell you a little bit about me in a moment, but I wanted to mention that several of our panelists couldn't be here today because of responsibilities at the legislature and also the storm. So representatives from TDS Telecom, Time Warner Cable, in the state of Maine were going to join us. But today you have me from Tilson and Karen from FairPoint, and we'll each introduce ourselves in turn. We're going to just skip through a few slides from my deck, and I think Karen's going to tell you a little bit about what FairPoint's been up to. And I think we'd like to reserve the majority of the time for a conversation with the group. If the last broadband session was any indication, people have a lot of questions and are eager to engage in a conversation about some of the concrete things that we can do to help fill in some of the gaps, or perhaps go from slow to fast in certain places. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation about that. But I guess I'll just start by framing up the conversation. And before I frame up the conversation, I'll give you a frame of reference on who I am. Again, I'm the president of a company called Tilson. We're located here in Portland. And we provide telecom consulting and IT consulting services for clients worldwide. But it's kind of fun that we're here in Maine, and that we're wrestling with some telecom development challenges here in Maine. So it's fun for us to be able to do some work in our own backyard and help our friends and neighbors and not get it on an airplane. I guess the next thing I'd say about us is that we're not a carrier. So I'm here speaking on behalf of a group of Get It Done guys who work for a lot of carriers. And I think the reason that I'm participating in this group today is that gives us some surface area to the marketplace. We talk to a bunch of different carriers. We talk to government agencies that help manage broadband. And we talk to consumers, people who are companies or organizations or towns that are trying to utilize broadband. So that gives us some perspective on how that's being done here in Maine and in other states and other countries as well. So just quickly to kind of frame up the conversation here, I wanted to talk about this idea of economic development and innovation. And if you were to look at the program guide here, it talks a little bit about why broadband, we're going to talk about why broadband is important for innovation and economic development. And I guess we can kind of ask these questions here, but the first thing I would say is we have a general consensus in 2012 that broadband is good for economic development, and it helps enable innovation. So we're not going to spend a lot of time today trying to prove the point that that's the case, but we're going to talk a little bit about specifically what it can do, and more importantly how we can get some more of it. So we're going to focus on the assumption that broadband is good for economic development, and we're going to talk about how we can get some more broadband. So I just have a few questions here that are kind of rhetorical questions, and actually Tom Murray from TDS helped me frame these up. TDS is an incumbent phone provider that has territories in rural Maine, and they provide telephone service in areas that are typically not very robust competitive markets, where they're the only game in town, and but for them there wouldn't be telephone service or there wouldn't be broadband. And he has some firsthand experience in some of these territories about particularly communities that have lost jobs in traditional manufacturing sector. So as we think about economic development, a lot of times the conversation starts with we're a community that has traditionally done quite well with traditional economy sectors. As manufacturing has waned in the United States, we've struggled to maintain our job base, particularly our high-paying job base. So mill jobs have been replaced with Walmart jobs, and while we're happy to have them, it's not the same. So how can we compete globally? And typically when those consultants show up in town and talk about how can you compete globally, it often comes down to innovation sector kind of marketplace, and it requires a workforce that can work remotely, a workforce that's educated, a workforce that has access to other people thinking and innovating. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of why, but mostly today we're going to talk about how. I'm going to break this down into two types of investment that we're seeing in Maine today, public investment and private investment. And the first caveat I'd put on that is that in many cases, it's a combination of public and private investment. And one of the challenging things about understanding the telecom landscape is understanding the interplay between public investment and private investment. And not in my slide deck, not as a part of this sort of general overview, we should touch on when we get into more of the conversational piece, what is the role of public investment in areas where the market hasn't responded. And in many cases, the type of public investment I'm going to talk about here are sort of big programs, not local programs. So these are going to really be focused on what are some of the big muscle movements of the big dollars coming into the state. And I think as we get into our conversation, we have to talk a little bit more about what are the ways in which individual communities are trying to shape public and private investment within their towns. So the first place I'll start is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. I'm going to use that as a starting point in discussing public investment. And that starting point is really in 2009 when the money became available and people started to submit grant applications. But that is something like year 100 on the lifetime of public investment in telecom infrastructure. But for the purposes of our conversation, as we're talking about broadband as opposed to just telephone service, I think it's a pretty good starting point because it involves a bunch of big projects in our region. And I'm going to provide just 3 examples of some projects that I've touched or that Tilson has some knowledge of, but these are just points of light in a much larger constellation of projects that we're not involved in and I can't speak to as much. The bulk of the federal money in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act came to broadband in 2 places. One through the Department of Commerce in a program called BTOP, which is an acronym that means, Broadband Technology Opportunities Program. And that came down primarily for big network builds, but also some other things that you've heard about today. It came in for mapping, came in for planning, it came in for sustainable broadband adoption. But the bulk of the dollars, the bulk of the $4.5 billion went into building big fiber optic facilities across every state. There was another big slug of money that came in through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And you may not know that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is in the broadband development business through a branch called the Rural Utility Service. And the Rural Utility Service typically invests in areas, as the name might suggest, that are rural and agricultural. And Maine benefited to the tune of about $9 million, all to TDS affiliates, to build last mile broadband. And so if you're not in a TDS territory, you didn't see this money, but you are in a TDS territory, you may have seen faster DSL than you had before, and DSL in communities that never had it before. In Maine, you also saw a new company come on the scene, the Maine Fiber Company, and the Maine Fiber Company received a grant for approximately $26 million of federal funds, which they matched with $7 million of private investment to build the 3-ring binder. And the 3-ring binder is a funny animal that's designed to serve telecom carriers and help those telecom carriers then in turn serve end users. And we can talk a little bit more as we get into the conversation piece of this about sort of what that means if that's of interest to people. But the cliff notes on the 3-ring binder is that any carrier, any telecom carrier can use it. It's comprised of something called dark fiber, and dark fiber means that it's fiber optics that haven't gotten the electronics necessary to deliver a signal put on them, and that it's available on a wholesale basis only, so that the Maine Fiber Company is serving carriers and people who are providing sort of big links between communities, but aren't directly engaging with customers and homes and businesses and public institutions. I will say it provides approximately 100 direct dark fiber connections to community anchor institutions, and that's kind of a big mouthful of acronyms and sort of terms of art. But what that means in English is that police stations and hospitals and schools and libraries and places that serve a public purpose got fiber right to their doorstep and should that institution choose to work with a retail provider. A retail provider could be a cable company, it could be a telephone company, it could be an internet service provider, any type of telecom provider, could then use that fiber to provide a service to that organization. I want to contrast this project to another one in Massachusetts that Tilson is involved in. It's not specifically relevant to Maine, but I want to provide it as a data point because the three-ring binder is one of 82 of these very large projects that's happening nationwide. And every state in the country got at least one of these big slugs of money to do this, and some states got more than one. So in Massachusetts, they're building a similar size network, about 1,300 miles. In Massachusetts, instead of a dark fiber network that requires a carrier to light the fiber, it's a lit fiber network, meaning that it provides actual service to end users. And in Massachusetts, it's about a $90 million project against a $32 million project here in Maine. So similar land mass, but sort of a richer project. And I just point that out because one of the things that we talk a lot about in terms of telecom here in Maine in reference to economic development is what's happening here in Maine without putting in context with the rest of the country or the rest of the world. So even as we build a fiber optic network here in Maine, there are other states that are doing the same thing from the same federal pot of money. And essentially, this is a stay even with our peers project. And in some cases, not even a stay even with our peers project. So when we start talking about economic development, and I think you'll hear a lot more about this when Karen talks, is that there's more to this story than just some of these big infrastructure projects. These start to create the conditions for which we can compete, but they actually don't differentiate us from other states. They mean that we're roughly on the same footing as other states, and additional investment in almost every case, but not every case, private investment is needed to complete those connections, to make the broadband fast, to provide next generation networks, to think about rich applications that people can make use of, and to fill in some of the gaps that some of these big federally funded projects don't fill in. So I just offer that as a contrast with the Maine project to remind everybody that we are talking about Maine, but in an economic development universe, it's talking about relative competition. And if large federal investment does anything, it levels the playing field between urban and rural areas within Maine, but it has actually created a fairly equal playing field between Maine and other states. So Maine isn't necessarily postured to be more competitive than New Hampshire or Vermont or Massachusetts for people who are heavy users of broadband, but it does provide us the opportunity to be on even footing with them, to go and innovate further and try and find ways to differentiate ourselves. And I think that's an important nuance that's sometimes lost in a conversation about just Maine. Several representatives from the Connect Maine Authority are here. In fact, the entire Connect Maine Authority is here. And the Connect Maine Authority has some of this BTOP money to do mapping and planning. Axiom Technologies is here. I see Susan in the audience. And this same federal program is also paying for sustainable broadband adoption, so people can adopt the use of the networks and provide better business cases in rural areas for people to adopt commercial broadband offerings and make them sustainable. The final piece of the federal program is a program to build public computing centers and provide education in those public computing centers. And Janet is here from the Maine State Library, and the Maine State Library received a grant under the same grant program to build 107 public computing centers and 11 video teleconferencing centers and libraries around Maine. And primarily, these libraries rely on existing broadband connections from FairPoint and other providers. But this particular slug of money was to help drive education for folks that might not have access either to those high-speed connections in their homes or to the more expensive computer terminals or the expertise that the librarians have or the curriculum that the state library has provided at those facilities. So this type of federal investment was not only in physical infrastructure, it was also in a whole continuum of services that looked at it holistically, have the physical infrastructure in place, but also educate people and give them access to terminals in places where everyone may not have a PC, or if they have a PC, they may not have access to educational curriculum. Just a quick map of the three-ring binder. It's a little bit washed out here, but you can generally make out the outline of the state of Maine. So this gives you a sense of the scale of some of these big fiber projects. Three-ring binder is approximately 3 rings, and it provides, again, wholesale open access fiber facilities for carriers to come into towns and then expand the service to homes and businesses. I want to talk just briefly about private investment, and you'll hear more from Karen specifically about FairPoint is doing, but I'll talk about the universe of private investment, I guess, investors here in Maine. The first are incumbent local exchange companies, of which FairPoint is certainly the dominant company here in Maine, but if Tom Murray was here from TDS, he would represent the second biggest phone company here in Maine. I'm not going to get deeply into that because you'll hear from Karen in just a minute. There's competitive local exchange carriers. These are other phone companies that don't have part of the Ma Bell territory. And they also provide both facilities-based services when they build their own telecom infrastructure, and they also resell facilities that they get on a wholesale basis from the incumbent telecom provider. And if that's an interesting area to the group, we can get into that a little bit and talk about what that means in your communities. Cellular providers are a big investor in Maine and have provided additional competition to all of the existing providers. They generally provide service all across the state, and depending on who your carrier are, you may feel like they don't do a great job in your community, but they do have a growing footprint here in Maine, and there's a handful of carriers. I think we have 5 or 6 active carriers building their own facilities, and nationwide they invested $65 billion in new cellular sites in the last year. So that's a really heavy network investment, and it's probably bigger than all of the other telecom investment market-wide nationally. So really big new players. In many cases, these wireless providers couldn't function without some other terrestrial telecom carrier. And what I mean by that is that the wireless part of a cellular connection from my iPhone to the tower only goes from the iPhone to the tower. At some point, it goes to a wire, and those wires are owned by these other carrier types that I've talked about: cable companies, competitive phone companies, incumbent phone companies. In some areas of Maine, we have wireless internet service providers, and I mentioned Axiom Technologies before that received the SpeedTop money. This is in places where it's generally not economical. To provide a wireline service, and a wireless service is the best way to reach areas with low density of customers. There's other wireless internet service providers that also sell wireline, like Pioneer Broadband in Aroostook County. I think I see Don in the back of the room. Hi, Don. And in that case, this would be a situation where the company functions both like a competitive local exchange carrier, where they might provide a wired connection using DSL or perhaps fiber or even cable in the case of Pioneer, but they would also provide a wireless connection in areas where there's really low density of customers and there wasn't enough of a customer base on a commercial basis to go out and build wire lines to every house. So in Maine, I think we're lucky to have kind of a diverse range of providers that bring a bunch of different technical solutions that deal with different economic conditions in localities and deal with different physical conditions in localities. And I think, if I'm guessing where the questions will go today, a lot of our conversation will be about the places that those carriers haven't been able to economically serve. And as we've built the 3-ring binder and provided additional fiber, and as some of these private companies have built their facilities and allow others to use them on a wholesale basis, I think you'll find that that the economic gap to get into some of those communities and focus limited capital dollars on the last mile is a little easier, but it may not be sufficient for some communities. So after Karen talks, I would encourage you to ask about what communities might do and what is the sort of intellectual framework of how a community goes about sort of dealing with a low density area where there isn't a commercial business case, where a company is never coming because it's just not economical, and we can kind of talk about some of those conditions. So without further ado, I will turn over to Karen.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I was just saying that I am not Mike Reed. I know that that's what the program says, but Mike was supposed to be in the committee hearing this afternoon in Augusta, although I heard late breaking news was that got that state offices got closed at 1 o'clock. So my name is Karen Romano. I'm the Vice President for Government and Education for FairPoint across Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. I want to tell you a little bit about FairPoint in case you don't already know. We were founded in 1991. We have a revenue of about $1 billion a year, and we serve telecommunication needs across 18 states, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont being our largest operations. But here in Maine, we employ over 1,300 employees, and they live in about 250 municipalities across the state. We maintain 186 buildings and pay taxes on them across the state, operate a fleet of over 550 vehicles. In 2010, we spent about $130 million in buying local for basically services and products that we needed to run the business. With the largest telecommunications footprint in Maine, and the carrier of last resort, we understand that we play a critical role in economic development for the state of Maine, and we take that responsibility very seriously. Broadband has transformed our communications world, making it one of the most critical tools for innovative and competitive economies in the world. I don't think anybody has to do a study. I agree with Josh to say, why is it important to rural communities to stay at broadband? I think that we all understand what a prominent role it plays in the fabric of both our social and economic lives. Bandwidth is a measure of this. Bandwidth is a measure of the data rate across the network. And the need for speed is growing exponentially. For FairPoint, we've seen growth to the extent of about 60% a year since 2005, and that there is no slowing in that growth. Services like video on demand, telemedicine, distance learning, we heard a little bit about that this morning, and other online applications are driving the demand for bandwidth, and I think that that's a surprise to anybody in the room. FairPoint is a partner in supporting economic development in Maine, a robust telecommunications network, as Josh has already mentioned, that increased broadband availability and economic development all go hand in hand. We recognize that. And we're committed to taking a leading role in using technology to expand and sustain local and regional economies. We want to help existing companies grow and succeed, and we want to help attract new businesses to the state of Maine. FairPoint has invested more than $172 million in our communications infrastructure since we arrived in 2008. We've built more than 3,100 miles of new fiber optic across the region, across Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, to bring broadband access to areas that were not previously served. This aggressive and unprecedented push for high-speed internet was financed by FairPoint and helped increase broadband availability from approximately 68% when we acquired the Verizon properties to more than 83% today. Now, I know that there's some controversy about the metric. Basically, we're using the standard that was prescribed in 2008. And I guess we'll let the courts decide how that gets measured. Since September of 2010, we've actually deployed DSL, high-speed internet service, to 260 hubs statewide and expanded broadband availability to an additional 44,000 homes and businesses in Maine. We've also completed the upgrade to our core network, which has resulted in our new network backbone infrastructure we call Vantage Point. It's a fiber optic core IP-based network designed to carry large amounts of data quickly and efficiently. This network is available in both a wholesale and a retail level. And it's designed as a matrix to provide the highest reliability. So the network design is a matrix design to provide the highest reliability and survivability across the 3 northern states. We also have diverse and redundant access to the internet, again, for that reliability that is attractive and necessary to businesses today. We really have 2 primary lines of data services. We have asymmetrical lines of business, which people recognize as DSL. Basically, that means that the directional upload and download is different. Download being the higher bandwidth, and really the definition, if you say, 10 meg, you're talking about download when you're talking about that asymmetrical service. This is primarily focused on consumer and small business because that usually meets their needs. We also have another line of business that's symmetrical, so that we have equal amount of bandwidth going up and down, and that's primarily needed for larger businesses and the education community. So we call these carrier Ethernet services. They include wide area, local area networks, point-to-point, and direct internet access. And we have speeds, those speeds go from 1.5 meg all the way up to a gig or more. And actually, the DSL speeds that are asymmetrical in nature are going up to 25 meg now as technology evolves, and it does depend on your distance from the equipment, but we are going up to 25 meg. So we have a complete product line over a very secure and survivable network, which is essential to meeting any business or community needs for high-speed bandwidth. Our Vantage Point services have already made a difference to the state. This morning you heard about the Maine School and Library Network, and I can see Jeff in the back. Basically, that became our anchor institution to push more fiber out and more broadband out to the corners of the state. FairPoint was a recipient of a large portion of that contract. We've got over 600 schools connected to that network. And another example, actually, that Josh touched upon was the wireless network. And I think a lot of people don't remember that the wireless network only extends from the handheld set to the tower. After that, it's riding over the wireline network until and if it's going to another wireless handheld device. FairPoint won a contract last summer to equip over half of the wireless towers in northern New England with our carrier Ethernet services to promote. This is actually enabling the wireless carriers to offer the next gen services like that we understand as 4G. That particular project has positioned FairPoint as a technology leader, as a best-in-class business partner, and also provides the platform, another platform from which we continue to expand and push broadband out to the different corners of the state. The challenge is, as I know, is that, and as Josh touched upon, is how you get to those final gaps. How do you finally achieve that broadband into those areas that it is somewhat uneconomical to reach with private investment? I don't think there is a question of, why broadband is important to rural communities. Broadband is as much of an economic engine today as I-95 was back in the 50s. And it can reach everyone, but therein lies the challenge of how we get there. FairPoint has made a significant investment, and we will continue to do so. Do we have anything else? If you want to open it up to questions.
Great. Well, let's. Can you hear me? Let's chat a little bit. Questions.
Hey, Josh. So with the 3 ring, where do you see the break point between the communities that say it's a no-brainer for going in to the ones that say we can't touch it? Is there a populace size? Is it a rural community of 5,000, or is it more based on geographically dispersed community?
So.
Do you see break points?
So specifically with the 3-ring binder, the decisions to use the network are typically happening not necessarily at the community level, but at the carrier level. So a carrier says, I need to get to XYZ community, and I'd like to get there in a way that's physically reliable and that's relatively inexpensive, and I want to deploy my limited capital within that community versus getting to the community. that would be sort of a carrier-driven decision as opposed to a community-driven decision. In places where carriers are unable to deliver a service at any price, for example, what we do see is some communities that will decide to take matters into their own hands and utilize the facilities. And the idea there would be that that they could utilize some of this fiber and using equipment that they can go out and buy and using their IT guys, that they could light the fiber to get from A to B. And we see that happening in certain limited circumstances where that there aren't carrier opportunities to do that kind of work, and essentially they take a facility that's proximate to where they need to be, and they can leverage that. But I think typically the use of the three-ring binder is largely driven by a community's proximity to it. The closer it is to the facility, the less expensive it is to extend service. And then typically the carrier that a community engages would have to have a willingness to then use the network and invest the capital that they have in those last mile connections. Does that?
Yeah, I guess how much collaboration is seen between the town and the carrier? Time Warner shows up first on your doorstep with the biggest purse, or FairPoint, which would be two of the bigger, they're going to get the most attention, I guess. Are they collaborating with the towns? Are they working on bond issues? Or are they just pretty much saying we either have the budget or we don't? Are the towns bonding it out? Or
Yeah.
the carriers, they're saying, no, don't bond anything. Let the carriers pay for everything.
So I think what we've seen in Maine is not yet bond issues to pay for last mile build outs. But maybe just pulling back for a minute, there's sort of three flavors of subsidy environment to get by a place where there's no business case. So in the case where you have a town that has, let's say, 20 houses per mile passed, then there very likely is a business case for a private carrier to come in and provide a service without subsidy. So if a cable company or a telecom company, whoever's territory it happens to be, at a certain density, it starts to make sense to deploy resources to bridge the gap. In places where there's less than that density, I'm really seeing three models. The first and the longest standing model is what we call a high-cost, low-cost averaging. And this is where using regulatory controls, a government, and this happens at both the state level in Maine and at the federal level, takes money from users in low-cost areas like cities and gives it to telecom companies in high-cost areas to deploy service. And this traditionally has been done just with regular telephone service. And if you were in the session earlier with Chairman Welch from the PUC, is something that the FCC has announced an intention to pivot to broadband use. So you see this high-cost, low-cost averaging, and it tends to happen relatively slowly. It was about a 30-year journey in the landline telephone business, and maybe something similar in the broadband world. The two areas that you're kind of alluding to are a place where a community provides a direct subsidy for a carrier to be there, and I'll add a third kind where a community provides a guarantee of revenue. So let me talk about those two, because I think this is especially relevant to those here representing communities where you may feel that there's a gap that a carrier isn't likely to cover because the business case isn't there. To entice a carrier to come to an area where the revenue doesn't make up for their costs, I see some communities providing a pure subsidy model. Community A, and I'm seeing this a lot in western Massachusetts and the Berkshires, which have some very similar demographics and densities to some of the most rural areas of Maine. A community will say, we're going to raise $20 million, we're going to build this facility, we're going to have an RFP, and we're going to bring in a network operator to provide the service, because if the facilities are free, then the operational cost is offset by the revenue and there's still a profit margin and it works fine. So that's sort of one way that I've seen go. What I find is that in places where there's a strong carrier presence, that can work quite well. So in the case of Massachusetts, if Comcast or Verizon are nearby and they just have to go a little bit farther and they can get sort of a direct subsidy to pay for the physical facility, that's a model that can work. In places that are more isolated from those carriers and are outside of their traditional service territories, another model I've seen is a revenue commitment. And the reason that a revenue commitment is different than the bond is that a revenue commitment looks different to the folks providing the money to the telecom company that's going to come there than the direct subsidy. And what I mean by that is a town says, we have 100, 150 users in this community. Those 150 users all really want broadband, and those 150 users understand that it's a high-cost area and that they're going to have to make an upfront commitment to entice someone to come. So the town, using some kind of mechanism, and there's about half a dozen mechanisms that can work, finds a way to prove to a carrier that that they'll have a long-term repeatable revenue stream from coming into that community, and that can come as a sort of tax and pay, where the town pays on a reoccurring basis something to the carrier from tax money. It can come as an adder to an existing municipal utility bill, like a sewer line, or in the case there's an electric utility in the town, on the electric bill. Or it could come as some kind of a direct customer commitment. And in some cases, in the same way that you get a lien on your house when the sewer line comes down the street for the first time until the sewer line is paid off, there's a lien on the house for the broadband service. So what I see communities doing is, if they're what I'll call a fringe community on the edge of an existing territory that a carrier is likely to be interested in, they provide a direct subsidy to tip the model. And in other cases, when they've got to really attract somebody from out of town who wouldn't otherwise be operating in that area, they have to provide some sense of a revenue commitment, because the capital markets, the folks that are providing money to these carriers to deploy new facilities, are much more interested in committed revenue because it fits in a capitalist model than something with subsidy from the beginning, which doesn't make a lot of sense and isn't replicable. So those are kind of, just to review, high cost, low cost averaging, revenue commitment, and last and probably least is this idea of providing a big slug of capital. But in places where it's kind of borderline to an existing territory, that bonding approach can be helpful.
I'll just add that bonding approach seems to be growing, and maybe because the others have kind of maxed out the opportunity there, I see more interest in the bonding, more and more towns coming forth with bonding ideas.
When you say you're seeing that, are you seeing that in Maine, or are you seeing that outside of Maine?
I have not seen it in Maine. I've seen it outside of Maine.
Okay.
Yeah, likewise.
And the revenue commitment, you haven't seen that type of,
No, these are happening in other states, but not in Maine today. I think one of the challenges in the past was that in many of the communities that faced these kind of problems, that they didn't have access to bulk bandwidth back to the internet anywhere near their community. So they weren't just talking about the cost of providing last mile facilities within a neighborhood. They were also talking about the cost of getting to town. And through the development of the 3-ring binder, through upgrades in FairPoint's network, through deployments from Time Warner, from a whole host of CLECs and cable companies and WISPs and cellular providers, some of those options to get to town now are available. So only now do you see the conversation turning to how do we bridge this last mile divide, because the cost to get into town has now been compressed fairly significantly. Yes, sir.
I got a, as you know, I'm from a very rural area who's been trying to get this connected up for quite some time, and I'll tell you that from the perspective of our area, the 3-ring binder, it was kind of a misconception there. We heard all about it. Our assumption was that, okay, because they're doing this, then the rural areas would then get connected, because now there's going to be a lower cost competitive pipe for people to come up with wires. But what I found out in my 2 years of trying to get us running is that FairPoint has told me they're not intending on using 3-ring binder, they're going to use their own networks. Time Warner's told me the same thing. And none of that changed the house per mile equation that we all suffer. You know, I live down a 4-mile road and there's 3 people on it, right? So FairPoint is not going to light that up. 3-ring binder's not going to light it up. Time Warner's not going to light it up. So it sounds like the only way this is going to happen is we either get a bond or get private investment or find some mechanism to do it without the providers, because we can't give them the mechanisms in place so they can make money. And they flat out told me that if you can't give me 25 houses a mile, we're not doing it. So, and I mean, I'm looking for an answer here, whether it's, go find someone with a lot of money, but there's a huge area of Washington County, as Susan can very well attest to, of a lot of people, there's over 5,000 small businesses there that can't connect. They're completely left in a black hole.
Yeah.
I'd like to know how to fix that.
So maybe I can speak to what I know about that, and you may talk about how FairPoint might approach a situation like that. So the 3-ring binder doesn't come close to everywhere. And when you look at the map, there's more white on the map than there is line on the map, right? So in communities that are proximate to the three-ring binder, carriers are able to make private investment in towns that would have otherwise been marginal from a return standpoint. So one example that comes to mind is Pioneer Broadband in a couple of communities in Aroostook County in the Cary, Amity, Orient, Danforth area. And these were communities that were relatively close to the three-ring binder, and using additional funding from the Connect Maine Authority to help cover some of the last mile build-out costs, Pioneer Broadband was able to get to town relatively cheaply on the three-ring binder, and then using some other funds build outs to some of those communities. But to your point, that's not a great solution if you're 20 miles off the three-ring binder. It really doesn't solve your problem. And to the extent that other carriers don't have facilities coming proximate to those communities, then essentially you're looking at a community, because there isn't an existing business model, really having to pay the freight on closing the gap between what's a sustainable business model for a private provider and what the conditions are on the ground. And I think that because the high cost, low cost kind of model, which is designed to solve this, the federal government is saying that it's going to spend, or I would say not spend, it's going to reallocate something like $4.5 billion of urban user money to rural areas for just these sort of areas that are not close to anyone. I don't think that's going to happen very quickly. They've made a 6-year commitment to do $4.5 billion a year. And if I were living in that community today and my livelihood depended on the connectivity, I wouldn't want to wait to the 6th year and be the last guy to have a bite at that money. So I think that leaves the community either taking matters into its own hands or some kind of a direct subsidy from a governmental jurisdiction that feels like this is a budgetary priority. And I think that's a county, state, federal kind of question at each level. So I don't think that there's an easy commercial answer for this, and I'll look at Karen because she probably has some more direct experience with this. But
Yeah, that you're exactly the kind of hole that is difficult to get to, and it's my personal opinion that that's where using some sort of public funding is appropriate, where no private investment is ever really going to be able to get a return. So seeking those avenues, and I would still say, the reason why FairPoint says we're not going to use the three-ring binder would be where we already have network. It's not that we're totally excluding it. It's a matter of if we already have network there, then we wouldn't use them. But if they're not going, to near you, which it sounds like what the problem is, then we both have that same problem. So again, I guess I would go back to what sort of public subsidy might be available there, with a Connect Me or some other federal avenue.
Yeah. And I think that subsidy to build to a carrier is either coming from the citizenry that want the service, or from a governmental agency who's going to find some other citizens to reallocate those costs from. So if you're not seeing a permissive grant environment, and I'm sure that you worked with the Connect Maine Authority and looked at some of those options, because the price per house has got to be in the thousands of dollars from a capital standpoint. Then my guess is at the end of the day, in this sort of fiscal and state budget environment, that money is coming from the citizenry. Yes, sir.
The topic of the discussion is economic development. No single infrastructure factor is going to make economic development happen. So to what extent do you see other initiatives recognizing, trying to link with, dovetail with the three-ring binder or the broadband build-out to enhance what they would have been doing without it, or to capitalize on what it makes possible in terms of education, in terms of other kinds of business development?
It's hard for me to speak directly to the economic development group, but I will say that many of them come to FairPoint and say, what do you have available? Can we leverage your investment in our area to attract businesses toward the area? Whether it's enough facilities to support a large, business customer or, government or education. We definitely will work with economic development groups to say, this is what you have in your area. There's nothing that you can't offer here, or, you can offer anything like this. When you're working to attract businesses to your area. I can't speak directly from the economic development group.
I want people to offer just a couple of examples of maybe what you're getting at. You can let me know if I'm kind of getting to the place that you're looking for. I see Jeff Letourneau is here in the back of the room. He runs the Maine School and Libraries Network and also the network for the University of Maine system. The three-ring binder provided some fiber optic facilities around the state, and if you look at the map, you'll notice that most of the university's facilities are picked up on this map, and there's partially a reason for that. Jeff Letourneau was one of the architects of the grant application, along with Fletcher Kittredge was in here. In the early days of the group of stakeholders in Maine kind of thinking about how do we go to market as a state for some of this federal money that's coming, they looked at how do we connect all the universities. So the three-ring binder provides some dark fiber facilities, and Jeff and his team light that fiber and provide really high bandwidth connections between the university sites, and that's important for research grants that the universities go out for. If you look at sort of the way that the National Science Foundation is allocating money, they're starting to evolve the requirements of the institutions that they're serving. And one of their requirements is that the data not be stranded in the university that does the research. So having a high-speed connection into a research university becomes a really important competitive factor in bringing in NSF money to do all kinds of different research around things that have nothing to do with broadband, but that broadband circuit is an enabler that allows that education or that research money to come in. And when the research money comes in, then the university is healthier and attracts students, and there's product development opportunities, and there's sort of that virtuous cascade of economic development things. So in and of itself, that broadband isn't valuable, but broadband as a competitive advantage in an NSF grant, or as I might have alluded to earlier, if everybody has this too, it's sort of if we don't have it, we're not participating. So it's a sort of stay even mission. That's kind of the economic development moment in my mind. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Groups like Eastern Maine Economic Development has changed their strategy or this programming that's meant to connect here and leverage what this provides.
I can't speak to that organization specifically, although I know they're typically a stakeholder at meetings like these and are certainly aware of the development that's happening. What I have seen on, for example, at Loring, when it was announced that the three-ring binder was coming to Loring, the Redevelopment Authority immediately started getting calls from Canadian firms that wanted to locate data centers in Aroostook County, and that was kind of an unanticipated consequence, but the kind of thing we hoped would happen.
I want to follow up on Danny's question. I live in Danny's region. I live on Route 1, Eastern Maine, and I have FairPoint's dark cable going on my house for 3-4 years now. I have no internet service except for the tracking satellite dish. When are you guys going to hook us up?
I gotta look at Karen for this one.
Part of that is I watched the three-ring binder go through the whole just a few months ago, so
Yeah.
you going to be ready before them or what? I pay $80 a month for crack, as well as my neighbors.
What community are you in?
Between Allison and Poore, right on Route 1.
So the trick is getting that DSL equipment close enough to you. So if you wouldn't mind giving me your address at the end of this session, I'll look it up for you.
Mike Reed has it.
Mike has it?
Yeah,
You may need to write your name then.
West Route 1.
So I would say that when you think about the Connect Maine Authority, the Connect Maine Authority is going to have a really hard time solving Danny's problem when the costs per home may be in the high 4 figures or even 5 figures. But in this situation where you're right next to the highway, this may be a place where Connect Maine Authority money coupled with the inexpensive middle mile fiber may bridge the gap. And where the Connect Maine Authority might not be able to have, been able to responsibly allocate the funds to serve just a few homes without some kind of middle mile facility. Now that there is a middle mile facility there, that may be a place where working with a carrier, and Washington County, of course, my eye turns to Susan, but that may be a place where there's an opportunity to fill that gap with other last mile subsidy.
9 years actually get out of town because so Don, I think.
I'll look at Don too. Yeah.
Topographically, as you go on Route 1, that tower there will not reach, I think it's more than 25.
Susan, do you want to talk about your sort of infiltration grant for picking up, the homes that are outside of traditional big tower footprints?
very specific, we call them no subscriber left behind, we actually take a neighborhood and try to figure out a solution. In some cases, we work with another provider for a DSL for, now coming down with fiber, and maybe it's a combination of both wireless and circuits. So, in Harold's case, yes, we need to look at more of a concentrated area versus a whole town.
So just for the benefit of our webcasters, what Susan said just very briefly was that for users that are out of the footprint of traditional line-of-sight wireless, which is a good tool that we can use to reach low-density housing developments relatively inexpensively, that she has a program where she's worked with the Connect Maine Authority to raise some public funds to match with her funds to do a no subscriber left behind program with dedicated equipment to get around whatever the physical barrier is to reach that home.
I got to follow up on that. Your response to Harold about, let me have your address and we'll get DSL. If you've got fiber running in front of his house, why would you go to the expense of putting in DSL, which by any standard in 5 to 6 years is probably not going to be adequate? Why wouldn't you just go with fiber?
You still need a mechanism to be delivering it, to light it up and deliver it.
It's expensive
I mean,
to put DSL out there.
Well, it's going to be expensive if we put them on fiber too.
But in the long term, isn't fiber 30 years down the road from now, you're not going to be looking at DSL circuits in people's homes. That's not going to be carrying next generation high definition video, and probably 3 or 4 years it's not going to carry it.
Right, and we're not, right. So I'd have to look at his address to tell you what.
Well, I'm just curious as to why FairPoint would be using their investment dollars on a technology that is basically going to be outdated in the short term.
Because, well, part of it is, but I mean, even DSL is going up to 25 meg now. So, being able to use what's, the facilities that are out there and being able to reuse them is the most cost-effective way to get to, rural, not very densely populated areas. And to bring a string of fiber to every home the idea of the DSL, it also multiplexes it so that you can bring one strand of fiber, hook it up into the DSLAM and then reach a lot, many, many more customers. So, that's all, kind of weighed through that. Even while I said that, I'll check to see where you are, I said to myself, I wonder if, a fiber solution would be even remotely affordable for him. And I'll look at that too.
I mean, I know, for instance, FairPoint is running fiber connections to the PV library in Eastport. They're running it to Shed High School. They're running it to Pembroke Grammar School.
Mm-hmm.
They're lighting up their fiber. You've got, I've ridden this route hundreds of times. You've got fiber all over the place.
Right.
And I'm just curious. I don't know the business case, obviously, but with all of this fiber out there, why the investment, knowing that in the future that is what you're going to need to get to be able to handle the data needs that we've talked about here all day today. DSL is not going to answer that question. And with all this infrastructure in place, I'm just curious as to why you wouldn't be going for the gold now instead of having to do it twice.
Well, so fiber to the prem, which is what you're talking about, yes. Bringing fiber to every home is a very, very expensive solution. And I believe there was a presentation this morning, I missed it myself, where they talked about GigU. I don't know if you saw that one, but where there's a kind of a confederation of universities across the country that are working at getting gig out to a community, an entire community. And the biggest challenge is not the technology there, but it's how you pay for that right now. So that's the issue.
Well, 5 years ago, my brother-in-law and I were desperate to get internet out on Shreve Island, and there was just no way it was getting out there. So we found 10 investors, including ourselves, and we just did it ourselves. We got a hold of Mailing Wire, helped talk us through it, set up the equipment. We ended up with 3 T1 lines and 3 or 4 backhauls because of the geographic configuration of our 5-mile island. And it was great. It's been great for 5 years, and we were able to do it with the Connect Maine money as well as our investments. We're not making any money on this.
Investment's really a
mistake.
Contributions.
Yeah, nobody's getting any money back, and they know they're not going to get any money back, even when we upgrade. Well, now we're at the point 5 years later. I'm so glad we did it. We had waited for the better and the more expensive and the better stuff to come along, we wouldn't have it. So 5 years later, we're like dial-up, back to dial-up now, and we're
ready to upgrade.
Move up and upgrade, and so we've got some more money coming to us as soon as we figure out how we're going to do it. And I just think sometimes you just have to go to the private sector and get the investments, and the town's going to contribute a little this time, but it was a tough go.
Yeah, that's a good
And
example.
a lot of people are living on Shabig now that wouldn't be living on Shabig now if it hadn't been for us going at it. We've got at least
Right.
5 full families with lots of kids, and it's made a huge difference.
That's economic development.
That's economic
So,
development.
so we, for our webcasting community here, we just heard from Shabik Island, and they had invested 5 years ago using private money raised primarily from the residents, it sounds like, to build a point-to-point wireless, 900 megahertz wireless technology, and now they feel like they've reached the end of the road on the capabilities of that system, and I think with some Connect Maine Authority money, they're looking to re-engineer for a faster technology. I think it's worth talking about just for a minute that that we're trying to solve a problem that's a little bit of a moving target. So.
And we will settle for DSL.
So DSL would be good, and I suspect that there'll be communities where we feel like DSL or cable or other last mile technologies like wireless are not sufficient to meet our growing needs. I know Susan Corbett in Washington County has dealt with that by offering wireline alternatives. If FairPoint, for example, builds DSL in that community, she can convert her customers from wireless to DSL to take the next step. But this river continues to flow, and I think the only thing we don't know what the needs are, but the only thing we're certain of is that there's going to be increasing, and they're going to increase faster than we probably think they are. So I happen to live in Portland, about 6 blocks from here, and my wife is an independent consultant, and she works in sort of e-media and marketing, and she really struggles to successfully run her business from home with limited upload speeds on what's pretty decent commercial cable. So one could argue, and if I were to look at Danny and say in Washington County, how would you feel about me saying this? One could argue that we're underserved here in Portland in the downtown area, and I'd be willing to argue, and we're running low on time here, but I do want to make sure that we say out loud that probably there's only a handful of customers in Maine today who are served in a way that's competitive from an economic development standpoint with the rest of the world. So when you look at other industrialized countries and the speeds and bandwidths available to them at a residential or business level, that generally we're not just competing between Portland and Washington County, we're competing against the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So generally when we look at urban rates in Maine, they're slower than they are in urban rates in other states. And when we look at rural rates, our rural rates actually compare pretty favorably from a penetration standpoint, thanks in large part to private investment from carriers that you've heard about, and also the Connect Maine Authority's aggressive grant programs with their private sector partners to build into some of these communities. But I just wanted to point out that the river is moving ahead, and even as we declare community served and move on to the next one, we have to go back to that community and figure out how do we make them competitive relative to other markets in the U.S. and abroad in communities where there's additional public funding for fiber to the premise. So we're not done yet, and I think that that the presentation by Sewell in the broadband strategy session earlier today did a really good job showing that, look, if 768 is served, then most of the state looks green. But if you go to 1.5 megabytes, it looks a little worse. If you go to 3 megabytes, it's a bloodbath. And if you go faster than 3, that's pretty much nobody. So, we're going to, within a year or 2 years or 3 years, I don't have the crystal ball, but we're going to start not even looking at that 768 map, and we're going to be focused on these higher speed tier maps. So I tend to think that as it becomes economical to serve higher density areas, you get back to this high cost, low cost averaging with faster service, then some of the slower service becomes cheaper to deploy in some of the most rural areas. But I think in the places, what I'll call a white space in Washington County, and some areas off the beaten path in Aroostook County, and probably some areas in very rural Franklin County. I see Ralph here, hi. some of those areas, but for massive subsidy, either from the citizens on their own account or from government, just won't happen. Exactly. So the question was, is satellite an answer? And I think we'd say that satellite will remain ubiquitous and expensive and inferior to terrestrial or line of sight options. Are we out of time, Phil? We're getting the black flag here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.